Alrighty, let us get going. We'll continue. Okay, so we're gonna keep going talking about families here. Whoa, where's my head at? Okay, so last time we were talking about families. We're gonna keep going today. A couple things to say, right? Yesterday I had kind of an extended office hoursy kind of thing. From 1 till 4. Probably had about 20 people show up to look at their exams. I will have another one on probably next Wednesday, so that people who have a more challenging Tuesday Thursday schedule might be able to come on Wednesday again, probably starting at 1. Like right after this class, I'll run back to my office. Not today because it's a lot, but next Wednesday definitely we'll kind of do that. Let me just think. I did rekey a couple of questions. There was maybe 2 questions that, and I will blame the textbook publisher because it's actually their questions that they wrote and they keyed, and I just imported into eClass. A couple of them were clearly miskeyed, so I rekeyed them properly. Mark may have gone down or up 1 or 2. So that's just on a question that was miskeyed if that happened for you. Yeah, okay. End of the semester blues I got. Okay, so what were we talking about last time? So we were talking about families, right? And we sort of ended on this slide more or less, right? Talking about the distinction between kind of the 2 major forms of coupling that we see in Canada today, which are marriage and cohabitation, right? Or cohabitation, living together. Okay. And again, these are, we talked about how these are slightly different, right? Both of them are typically sexual relations and common residence, right? But they start in different ways, right? Marriage starts with a ceremony and contractual obligations, right? And witnesses and all of this fun stuff. Sometimes with a fancy dress, but that's not always necessary. Clearly defined roles, right? Because typically people get married, people have a pretty definite sense of what that means, and they have more enforceable legal penalties. Whereas cohabiting, usually starts, like I said, the typical script, if you look at the social science literature, is someone's lease was up, so they decided to move in together to save money. Rights, to property are much less recognized, and it's much harder. There's legal efforts now to figure out what, a split in cohabiting relationships looks like, but it can get very nasty because, one of my friends, I guess we were in our 20s, I guess at that point, and he had moved in with a lady, and they broke up, and quite literally, she broke up without telling him. So one day when he was off at work, she just literally cleaned out the apartment and took everything, right? Like just had her friends come in, put everything in boxes, and just left with everything: plates, cutlery, the Nintendo, right? The TV, the bed, everything was gone. He just got home and the apartment was completely empty, and he tried to sue her to get some of his stuff back. She had already pawned it, but there was no legal recourse because there's no documentation as to who owned what, right? They hadn't kept receipts or anything like that. So basically it was, from a legal perspective, it was like, well, that's too bad for you. You really should have thought about cleaning out your stuff before she got to it. And that's the kind of legal problems that we're seeing with cohabiting relationships becoming more common. Okay, so when we talk about Canada, the rate of cohabitation has definitely risen significantly, right? If we go back to the 1980s, the halcyon good old days of traditional Canada, I don't know if that's true or not. In the 1980s, right, only about 5.5% of couples were cohabiting and not married, right? If we look forward then to 2016, and these numbers will have changed a little bit since then as well, it's up to about a little over a quarter of people living together as a couple are cohabiting, right? It's not evenly distributed either, right? The rates of cohabitation across Canada vary significantly. You have places like the Maritimes where the rates are considerably low, in the single digits. And then in Quebec, which has the highest rate of cohabitation, where you're approaching almost 40% of people cohabiting in Quebec. So, it's not evenly distributed. Quebec has more cohabiting couples than anywhere else in Canada. And this seems to be really because of a cultural shift that happened in Quebec. If you go back to the 1960s, what was called the Quiet Revolution, where Quebec society really sort of detached itself from its religious roots, right? More or less abandoned Roman Catholicism as its core ideology, and became much more secular and much more liberal than the rest of the country much more quickly. The Maritimes, right, which are much older, see the lowest rate because they have fewer young people, and the young people that were born in the Maritimes tend to move away. So you have, a much smaller percentage of people living together who are cohabiting rather than married because there's just fewer young people. Young people tend to be more liberal. Alberta's somewhere in the middle, right? Fairly young population, but also a little bit more kind of traditional and religious in some ways than the rest of the country. To some extent. That's not universally true, but we'll talk about that when we talk about religion. Okay. The average age, one of the things that's kind of interesting when you look at the social science literature on cohabitation is it's often conceived of as a kind of testing, right? Trying out relationships to make sure that people are compatible and that they last, right? And so cohabitation, the length of cohabitation for those who are not married is on average about 3 years. So it's a relatively short union, right? Most cohabiting relationships actually break down, and that includes cohabiting relationships where people have children together. They're much more likely to break down than married relationships on the whole. It's come to be seen in a lot of ways, especially by millennials and Gen Z, as a sort of defense against the possibility of a marital breakdown, right? When you look at the social science, literature, and where they've interviewed people, they've done these qualitative interviews and asked, why did you choose to cohabit rather than get married? A lot of it, there's a lot of financial issues, but a lot of it too, people will say that they are doing it because they want to make sure that they are compatible, right? That they don't mind living with the other person. I can't remember who it was. I heard this in a podcast, and I can't remember who said it or what the context was. I know they had blue hair. Aside from that, I don't remember. Maybe it was Destiny. Maybe the person's name was Destiny. I can't remember. I sort of encountered this. And basically, this person was like, you're not really dating someone until you've lived together because you have no idea what that person is like. And this is the sort of like Gen Z millennial sort of mindset, right? That compatibility has to be really rigorously tested before you would ever consider moving into marriage. And marriage has become, increasingly, here, I'll just write it on the screen, seen not as a starting relationship, but as a capstone, right? A term from architecture, right, where you put like this beautiful finished stone on top of a completed building. That's how people increasingly see marriage, right? So people will often now kind of use cohabitation to test out relationships, right? Before you would ever think of getting married, you want to, find out if the person leaves their socks in the kitchen sink or something. I don't know, that sounds gross and probably doesn't happen, but who knows, right? People have weird habits, right? Or leaves plates everywhere, or, how they deal with dirty clothes or dirty plates or habits or these sorts of things. So, it's seen as now an intermediate step on a path potentially towards marriage, maybe, although the rate of marriage is declining. So more people are choosing to just stay in cohabiting relationships semi-permanently. Okay. For others, other couples, cohabitation is just an alternative to living alone. Particularly, it's an alternative to paying two rents, right? Especially as the cost of housing goes up, it's become increasingly attractive to young people to just live together with a romantic partner, even if it is considered short-term, ultimately because, the two incomes can support, a rent a lot more easily than one can. Increasingly seen as an alternative to marriage, right? We are seeing people who now never want to get married, and are suspicious of the institution of marriage for a bunch of reasons. I started to say this and it was in my head, and then I skipped a beat and went somewhere else. One of the things that's true of Gen Z and millennials in particular is they're the children in a lot of cases of the generational cohorts that were sort of the first in on like really rapid rises in divorce, and for whom, you know, the divorce of their parents was really traumatic, right? So basically, you know, no fault divorce becomes the law of the land in Canada. You know, in the 1980s, I think 1986 is the amendment to the Divorce Act in Canada, which makes no fault divorce kind of the norm legally across the country. And what that does is it causes a huge spike in divorces, right? So millennials, who are mostly the children of the baby boomers, and Gen Z, who are for the most part children of kind of Gen X or very old millennials, basically experience a lot of parental divorces in their life. Like they're the ones who experience, right, the 50% and above kind of divorce rate of their parents. So for them, they want to spare both themselves the danger of divorce and any potential children that might come, the risk of having their parents be divorced, because it was such a difficult experience for them. Okay, I realize I have like no question slides. Marriage is just too expensive. Why do you need a piece of paper binding you to someone when you could just exist with them? Sure, whatever you want. Who am I to judge? Okay. So, the other thing that's happened too is a whole bunch of different kind of sexual relationships have emerged. And this is fundamentally an outgrowth of the sexual revolution of the... I just hope it didn't break, whatever it is. Always worried that that's someone's laptop that just went... Anyway, apologies for drawing attention to you. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of kind of new relationship forms that have started to kind of come about as a result of the sexual revolution and the possibility of birth control, right? So prior to, right, really the 1960s in Canada, the late 1950s, early 1960s in the United States, sex was risky business, right? If you were having sex, in pretty short order, someone was going to get pregnant, you know, in all but a few circumstances where, you know, infertility might exist. But, you know, the chance was that if you were having sex, someone was going to get pregnant. And that was, you know, outside of marriage and outside of kind of a protected relationship economically, that was a sort of disaster, especially for women, right? So relationship forms were very, very conventional, really until the 1960s, because it was just so economically and socially dangerous for women to have sex and then get pregnant and have a child out of wedlock. Once you get birth control on the scene, this really opens up the possibilities, especially for women, to experiment with having sex, and without the necessary consequence of getting pregnant. Now, of course, this also means that there's a huge social push for the legalization of abortion, which follows relatively quickly after, you know, the approval of the birth control pill as a contraceptive, because, you know, sometimes contraception fails, and so people really wanted a kind of fallback position, right, which was abortion. For the most part, right? So you see this in 1973 in the United States, right? You get the very famous case, Roe v. Wade, right? Which makes contraception, that's Griswold v. Connecticut. Contraception is made, you know, basically a constitutionally protected right by a case in, I want to say 68, called Griswold v. Connecticut. But Roe v. Wade, which I believe is 1973, makes abortion legal. So it's a little bit, about a decade after contraception becomes widely available in the US. In Canada, it takes a little bit longer. It's not until the 80s with Crown v. Morgentaler that abortion becomes legal across Canada. But it all kind of, but contraception became available, or the pill became available as a contraceptive in Canada a little later than the US as well. So it all kind of follows, right? You get contraception, you get more sexual experimentation. Sometimes that contraception fails, and you get, a need for abortion as a sort of, typically a kind of fallback position. Okay, all sorts of new relationship forms start to propagate as well. And kind of, it goes through a bunch of things, like living together is one of these. Once you get into the 1990s, right, and really the arrival of like late Gen X and millennials into emerging adulthood, they generate all sorts of new forms of relationships and a whole vocabulary around, these different relationship forms. And you're probably, I don't have to tell you about any of these, though I will, because why not? We got time, right? What time is it? Yeah, we got another 30 minutes to kill. No, I'm kidding. I got lots to do. So, friends with benefits, right? This is all right, let's start in order, right? The basic one that most emerging adults experience is the hookup, right? And the hookup is distinguished from older forms of coupling, like dating, right? Dating, has really existed in the form that we think of it really since about the 1930s, right? Before that, very different kind of arrangements people would have. It was more courtship would have been the norm. Dating, you get kind of coming around in the 1930s. Once you get, contraception being widely available, you get what's called the hookup, right? So these are spontaneous, one-time sexual encounters between strangers or acquaintances, right? Often also referred to as one-night stands. Like, I guess if you go back to the 80s and 90s, this would have been more commonly referred to as a one-night stand. People having these really, really short sexual kind of interludes with people. Now, one of the kind of people who's done research on hookup culture is a lady named Donna Freitas, and she has a really interesting definition of the hookup, which I really like, because she talked to something like 5,000 American undergrads, or she surveyed 5,000 American undergrads and interviewed like 500 of them, and came up with this definition of the hookup, which is, short, brief sexual encounters, but they can be anything from like kissing all the way to having sex, right? And anything in between those two positions. She says this is mostly because, in particular, young men get a kind of social benefit from having a larger number of hookups, right? A larger number of perceived sexual partners among their peer group. So widely defining sex as anything from like furiously making out in the corner for 5 minutes at the end of the night, all the way to taking someone home and sleeping with them, all kind of fits under this definition of the hookup. And again, good for men typically because it's like, yeah, hey bro. This is how my son talks. He's 10. I hate the word bra so much. BRUH, I believe, is the spelling. I'm like, please, we're cultured people here. Don't say bro. Anyway, hey bro, I totally hooked up with Linda last night. Okay, right? And really, all they did was like, they were both on the couch at the end of the night. Neither one knew where their roommates were. She looked over at him. He looked over at her. They're like, do you wanna? Sure. And they made out for like 5 minutes, and that was hooking up, right? But he's going to say they hooked up because that is going to be perceived as they had sex even if they didn't, right? Okay, so that's the hookup. Friends with benefits, which Freitas refers to typically as multiple recurring hookups, right? So basically it involves a casual and occasional sexual relationship with a friend or an acquaintance without commitment or romantic feelings for one another. And Freitas will say, without romantic feelings for one another is really important. And from this, right, you get another piece of sort of late millennial Gen Z vocabulary, which is catching feelings, right? And catching feelings is the end at some point of the friends with benefits relationship, because if one person catches feelings and the other one doesn't, usually that leads to yet another piece of millennial slang, which is ghosting, right? Where one person disappears and stops returning phone calls. Maybe occasionally they get a booty call out of it, but for the most part, it's over. God, I love this. I love this. I'm like, when did you ever think you were going to hear booty call in a university lecture? And here it is, right in front of you. Okay, and this one, which actually, is now gotten pretty rare. It was pretty common, for older millennials. I haven't heard it in a long time. Which was living apart together. which was, two people basically kind of intermingling their possessions, right? She clears out a sock drawer for you and you leave some stuff at her place, or however it goes, right? And you do the same for her. You might live, you're together most of the time, but you're both maintain separate residences. And that used to be, I think, a little bit more common. I haven't heard the term in a while, but I used to hear it all the time. Oh, just as I was starting that, I thought of another one that was interesting, and now it's escaped my brain. There's all sorts. It's such an interesting topic. Hey, if you want to know more about it, when I talk about sex and sexuality, aside from like 3 lectures about pornography, which we don't show any porn, we just talk about it. Don't worry. In Sociology of Youth, I have a whole section on all of this stuff, and we go into great detail about kind of millennial and Gen Z sort of weird relationships. Oh, I remember what it was. Sorry. I'm so random. I'm sorry. What is it? The DTR? Another piece of slang. Again, I don't know how much this one is used because I'm now too old and none of my friends do this anymore. Define the relationship, right? Define the relationship talk where, there's a few of these, and because I just get like snippets of this in the Whatever podcast, which shows up in my like YouTube shorts, and I hear some of this stuff, and it's like the talking stage, right? We're just in the talking stage, right? Which I like. What does that mean? Isn't that every stage of every human relationship is the talking stage? What else do you do? Wait, I know, but not all the time. There's certain times where you don't talk as much, I suppose. But right, define the relationship, right, is this stage where people are in this indeterminate relationship, right? Maybe they're here, maybe they're here. And it's like, well, we've been hooking up for a long time, right? And we're friends with benefits, but what is our actual, or we're dating, but are we dating like 5 people at once? Or I'm dating 1 person and they're dating 3 people. And no, I forgot to time up the projector. Oh. Sadness. Now it takes like 5 minutes to turn it back on. I'm going to keep talking. I'll turn the screen back on in a sec. I'm stupid and forgot to turn the projector on. All right, forgot to add time to the projector, which I almost never do. I've only done it twice this semester in this class. In other classes, all the time. Okay, I'll just talk really loud. I have a big voice. I can fill the auditorium, so I'll just dial up the volume, blow out the YouTube recording so it sounds like I'm on Mars. Maybe I'll move this down a little. Right, so all of these kind of relationship forms, right, this all comes fundamentally out of the transformation of families, right? And the transformation of relationships that come from the sexual revolution, right? It's only birth control that makes all of this indeterminacy possible, right? Because none of this kind of stuff really would happen in the past because people, proceeded through relationships much faster. Right? In the past, if we look at, say, the boomers or the silent generation, you're talking about people's first marriages happening at about 22, right? On average. For women, a little bit earlier, about 19 to 20. For men, 22 to 23. Why? Well, because, adults want to be in sexual relationships. And in order to be in a sexual relationship and not risk someone being massively disadvantaged, economically or socially, ultimately, you needed to make sure that you were in a marriage, right? Where at least there'd be some reciprocal rights and reciprocal obligations to, your spouse and your child, especially for women. This was really, really important. Birth control completely blows this up. And now, we're in Aldous Huxley, brave new world. We're in a brave new world of relationships, which means everything is kind of indeterminate because all the old social patterns around relationships that had been established for centuries and decades all get completely blown up by birth control. So, when you're having that define the relationship talk and you're frustrated, or you're like the girls on the Whatever podcast, which I've never listened to because I was like, oh, that seems kind of interesting. What? 4 hours? I ain't got time for that. And just watching the smarmy guy who runs the podcast make fun of OnlyFans girls is not that amusing. But, when you're having these kinds of relationship talks, think back and you can say either you're happy about it and you can say, thanks, birth control. Or when you can't get someone to commit to you, you can be like, Thanks, birth control. Because it all comes down ultimately to that gigantic technology, which has caused just an enormous amount of social change and dislocation. 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2. That was early. Ta-da! Okay. All right. Right, so same-sex marriage, definitely another kind of change in relate. There we go. Another change in relationships, right? Okay, so same-sex marriage, a relatively recent phenomenon as well, right? Same-sex marriage in Canada basically becomes legal around 2005, around 2005, when the Canadian Supreme Court basically tells the government at the time of Paul Martin that Canada's laws barring same-sex couples from marrying are unconstitutional, and same-sex marriage becomes the law of the land in Canada. Now, Canada was one of the earlier adopters, I think, along with Denmark and a couple of other very progressive European countries. Canada was among the first to make same-sex marriages legal. The United States would take a further 10 years after same-sex marriage became legal in Canada to basically join the club, when a case called Obergefell, but Obergefell versus who? I can't remember. Anyway, the case is referred to as the Obergefell case. It's always like Obergefell versus someone, but I can't remember who the versus was in the Obergefell case. But this case went to the U.S. Supreme Court, and same-sex marriage was ruled by a one-vote majority. It was like a 5-4 vote in the U.S. Supreme Court to make same-sex marriage, to declare that bans on same-sex marriage were unconstitutional. Prior to that, it had been sort of piecemeal across the U.S. Different states allowed it. Other states did not. Okay, so yeah, this definition of kind of marriage has been added into kind of the more traditional vocabulary with much, weeping and gnashing of teeth from all sorts of groups who have opposed it. And like different places in the world, right, it's been kind of uneven. I think France, I can't remember if it's legal now, but they had a big controversy around proposals to legislate it, which always surprises me because I always think of France as very progressive. Okay, so when we talk in terms of like how many same-sex kind of families there are, or married same-sex couples there are in Canada, it remains relatively small. And despite being legal, the number of, or the percentage of same-sex couples that have chosen to get married remains, in the minority, right? It's still not a majority of even same-sex couples that have chosen to get married. So you see that basically, like when you look at same-sex couples, it sort of topped out in 2016 at about a third of same-sex couples choosing to get married, right? So, and they only account, in the 2016 census, they recorded 72,880 same-sex married couples, which accounted for less than 1% of all coupled households in Canada. So it remains a very small phenomenon, but it is legal in Canada and kind of vociferously defended in Canadian law. Okay. Getting into I've heard the term situation. Okay, I need someone to define this for me. What is a situationship? Because I've heard this term and I haven't bothered to look it up. So type it in here. I need to know. I want to know because these are all fun. Off-topic question, wondering if the final will follow the same format as the midterm, 45 multiple choice questions and you providing access code. Yes, it's exactly the same. 100%. I want the definition of a situationship. Is there any reason why men aren't allowed birth control rather than women? Is it like living apart together is dating, but sometimes you sleep at their house and you keep stuff there. So I don't know. Is that dating? I don't know what dating is anymore. I'm very old and I got married a long time ago. Is there any reason why men aren't allowed birth control rather than women? When you're just in the talking stage with someone, it's complicated. I love how Facebook's relationship statuses eventually came to just define how people understand relationships. Yeah, male birth control is not as effective generally. It hasn't been really successfully tested, and I know women will roll their eyes at this, but it tends to do things that men don't like cause you to gain weight and lower your libido. And so it's been really, really difficult to convince men, even in the test groups, that it's worth it, because they're like, well, my sex drive is way down. And I know, because women are like, yes, that's what happens when you take birth control as a woman as well. So yes, it's like rolling, slight eye roll, but that's one of the reasons, right? It's been developed, it doesn't work as well, and it's been very, very negatively received by the men who are in the kind of clinical trials. Okay. Situationship is when you guys like each other, but you guys are not dating. Brah. Oh my goodness. Okay. You have now reached the vocabulary level of my 10-year-old. Awesome. You like each other. Okay. That's cool. I like that. That's a fun definition. I don't know what it means, but okay. Well, I see they wrote guys twice, but that's fine. Whatever. I get it. Two people like each other, but you're not in a relationship. You're not dating. Maybe you're hooking up. Who knows? I don't know. I'm too old for this topic. Way too old. I'm like, honestly, like, hilariously enough, like, I'm like a person out of time. Like, I got married at an age which would have been much more typical of, say, the silent generation, because I got married when I was 23, and I've been married ever since. So I've been married for a really long time, but she's great. Why wait, right? Okay, so prior to divorce, let's talk about divorce. Not mine. Michelle, if you're listening, everything's okay. No, trust me, my wife would never bother to listen to my lectures. She hears me talk enough at home. It's just a joke. All right, prior to 1968, right, when we look at what it took to get divorced in Canada, there were two possibilities for why you would be able to get divorced. One was adultery, and the other one was cruelty. Now, adultery was extremely difficult to prove legally. Why am I talking like William Shatner? It was really hard to prove legally, to the extent that a court would actually accept that as a reason for divorce, right? So it's not like adultery was uncommon, right? Men especially would have mistresses and they would have affairs, right? Women would too, but it's a little bit more common for men. But it was hard to prove, right? So the court would require things like, a hotel register that was signed by both people, which was pretty hard to produce, right? If you were reasonably intelligent, you wouldn't both sign the hotel register. Evidence that the person had visited a brothel, right? These sorts of things would have been, grounds for divorce, but they were extremely hard to prove, and courts had a very high standard of evidence for these things. Cruelty, different places had different rules around cruelty, right? So there was things like, obviously, physical abuse could be grounds for a divorce, but again, it was really difficult to prove, because the person would have had to go to the police almost immediately and report that they had been physically abused. There would have to be physical evidence of the abuse, right? So broken bones, bruises, this kind of thing that were kind of incontrovertible. And we know, with abuse, people tend to underreport it. What happened, people would separate and live apart, but never formally divorce, right? And it was very male dominated, right? Men had a lot more power when it came to granting divorces than women did. So it was very unequal. Okay, the Divorce Act of 1968 changes things a little bit. So in 1968, right, what you get is the Divorce Act, and it basically says, okay, adultery, cruelty, or after a 3-year period of separation, you can get divorced, right? Now again, this is all showing cause, right? Both this kind of older form of divorce prior to 1968 and the 1968 Divorce Act, you had to show cause, right? So either basically, you were abused, there's adultery, or what would have been called spousal abandonment, right? So that 3-year period of separation was basically grounds for saying that you'd been abandoned as a spouse, right? And that this person was no longer living as your spouse, so you should be able to get a divorce. Okay. So it expanded the grounds for divorce, but didn't, kind of universally make it available with no cause. All right. 1985 in Canada, right? This is the big one, and this is when you see the great big spike in divorce. Sorry, I said 86. I meant 85, apparently. Once, basically, you could give any reason for divorce that you wanted, right? It basically brought in no-fault divorce. You just had to cite marital breakdown, defined in one of 3 ways. But the simplest one, and this is still what we live with today, and I now know this because I have 2 friends who are both going through divorces at the moment. Not a fun process, let me tell you. If you can avoid it, highly recommended. 1 year of separation now is basically, you don't have to give a cause, but you have to be separated for 1 year before you can file for divorce. So you have to officially, file separation papers, and then 1 year later you can file for divorce. Okay. As it stands, as of about 2018, 41% of marriages end in divorce before the 30th year of marriage, right? It used to be above 50%, tracking almost towards 60, but, as some of the, I guess, people who were in unhappy marriages in the 80s got divorced, that number has gone down, and fewer people are getting married today. More people choosing, like the commenter at the beginning of the class. It's like, I don't need no marriage certificate. I'll just live with the person. I'll just exist with them. Fine. But that's meant the divorce rate has gone down. And this is one of the tricky things, right? Because, we say the divorce rate has fallen. But one of the things we don't track very well is the breakdown of cohabiting relationships. If we did, we would see that a lot of quasi-marriages, like people living together long-term, break down, and that rate would probably go up above 60% at this point. Okay. Predictors of divorce. This, yeah. Anyway. So if this is you're out of luck. All right, interpersonal factors. Unhappiness with one spouse, right? So if you don't like your spouse, or you've, fallen out of love, or depending on what your conception of why you should remain married, that's a big factor. Conflict, including violence. But the big one here is actually not violence, it's money. Conflicts about money, spending habits, lack of funds, right? Basically struggling to pay bills, pay rent, going into debt, and conflicts over that. Gambling addictions obviously play a big role as well. Those ones play big into divorce as well, right? So conflicts, including violence, but the number one kind of conflict factor is money in some way, shape, or form, right? Okay, one or both partners struggling with substance or mental health problems. This is my one friend, Matt. He's a great guy. And I asked him, well, why do you think you guys got divorced? And he was like, well, very simple. She crazy. Not very kind of him to say about his ex, but that's literally what he told me. So it's fun. Mental, I think she's bipolar, and won't get treatment, and, finally he'd had enough. So anyway, whatever. And mental health problems do potentially lead to breakdowns of marriages. Infidelity, obviously, right? If you're cheating on your partner, that will tend to cause problems as well. All right, demographic factors. Women are more likely to initiate divorce than men are by a wide margin. It's somewhere, depending on which numbers you look at, between 80 and 90% of marriages are initiated by women rather than by men. Earlier in marriages, it's more likely to occur. Some people talk about the 7-year itch is a term you hear. I remember when I'd been married to my wife for about 7 years, people were like, oh, are you getting that 7-year itch? I was like, what are you talking about? And they were like, well, that's when lots of people get divorced. And I can say this is true of a lot of our friends, that they did sign around 7 to 10 years, sort of be like, I've had enough of this. And things get hard, especially once you have kids, and that can cause some issues as well. So more likely to occur like in that first 10-year window. Once you get past 7 to 10 years, you're usually pretty safe until your children all move out. And then there's another period where there's a slight chance of getting divorced, but whatever. Okay, couples who are religious are less likely to divorce, particularly when they belong to the same religion. No surprise here, right? Religious communities of all sorts, Christians, Muslims, Hindus and Sikhs all prize, and those are the, did I say Muslims? Jews, yeah. Anyway, all the big religious traditions tend to prize marriage and intact families in major ways. And so if you are deeply integrated into a religious tradition, it's likely that you view marriage in, almost in sacred ways. And so the breakdown of marriages is actually something that happens less to people who are very religious, and especially when they are of the same religion, right? A little bit more common in mixed religion marriages. But, if you're both Catholic or you're both Protestant or you're both Muslim or both Hindu, right, pretty good chance that marriage is going to hold together at least for longer. Okay, social factors, poverty. Come on, Pen. Poverty is a big one, right? And that goes back to money. Money's a big problem. Having less education, right? The people who are most likely to get divorced are people in the working class, and typically people with a high school degree or less, right? These are the most likely people, if they got married at all, increasingly they're not, high school degree or less, most likely to get divorced of all the kind of groups. And I'm sorry to say this because I know this is, I said that a lot of people test out relationships by cohabiting. Probably not due to cohabiting, but probably due to kind of underlying conceptions of what relationships are, how they work, and at what point you should be exiting a relationship, right? Social factors, values factors. But people who cohabit, who are probably more likely to be socially liberal, probably more likely to have a view of marriage that is entirely predicated on emotivism, right? How do you feel about the other person rather than a sense of duty that you would find, say, more with these folks. More likely to divorce, right? Because they don't view marriage as permanent. It's contractual. It's entirely contractual. It has no religious aura, right? It's just, what was it? I went to a marriage, and I remember the vows because it was funny. It made me laugh because I'm like, well, yeah, I can, whatever. But it was like, we promise to be true to each other as long as love lasts. And I was like, that ain't gonna last long. And it didn't, by the way. Just about 4 years. Anyway, it's funny. Long enough that they didn't have to return the gifts, but not much longer than that. Okay, premarital birth or previous marriage, right? So if you're in your second or third or fourth marriage, more likely that relationship's going to end in divorce as well. Thanks for coming to my comedy hour. No. I laugh at my own jokes at least. Okay. And having grown up in a house without two consistently married parents, right? If your parents were divorced, more likely you're going to end up divorced as well. I hear the rumblings of people wanting to leave. So maybe I won't let you go. I still have 5 minutes. I can't let you all go 5 minutes, but I understand. All right. So consequences of divorce. There's been a lot of debate about the literature on the consequences of divorce, right? And most of the literature points to relatively negative consequences for children, right? That for the most part, the children of divorce experience significant problems. It's much more acute for male children than for female children. And the reason here seems to be that the most common kind of setup is that children are in the custody of their mother, right? Like that's the way that the legal system has kind of shaken out. Women get custody of the children far more often than men do. And so the idea has been, and it's pretty well backed up by social science data, that male children miss the same-sex kind of parent and miss that kind of relationship and bond with that parent more than female children do because they're living with their mothers, right? So it's harder on boys. Surprisingly, it's actually hardest on adolescents more so than it is on younger children, right? So if your parents get divorced at like 3 years, when you're like 2 or 3, that ends up becoming kind of the norm, right? Your understanding of what your world looks like is shaped by that experience of your parents being divorced. If, however, you go through 10, 12, 13 years having co-resident parents married, and then it breaks down, you're now taking a long-term pattern of expected kind of relationships and security and breaking it apart relatively later. So adolescents whose parents get divorced suffer considerably more than very young children. And children kind of between 4 and 14 are kind of somewhere in the middle. The experience isn't great, but it's also not as bad as it is for adolescents. All right, 2 minutes. I'll do this very quickly. So early studies, tended to find deficits in well-being for the children of divorced parents. These studies were flawed for a bunch of reasons, right? They didn't have a control group, for one, and they didn't account for how children were doing before their parents got divorced. Later studies, right, tended to find that it depended on how the divorce was handled by parents, right? If friendly relationships happened rather than a contentious divorce, that was better for kids. If they still got to see the non-resident parent or shared custody, that tended to be a lot better. If they got to see the non-resident parent daily or at least very often, it was better. And if children were allowed to express their feelings about it, it tended to mitigate a lot of the problems. All right, I'll leave it there. We'll come back. We'll start on this slide on Friday. We'll finish up families, and we'll start on religion. Yes?
I was looking for your office yesterday, and I asked like 10 people. They don't know where your office
Okay. It's on the first floor of Torrey. Kind of on the... So if you come into Torrey from business, right, you go up the stairs on the first floor, and basically you go to the right, and we're basically at the end of that hallway. And if you go too far, you'll know, because you're going to exit the doors and end up on the river valley. So,
okay.
Yeah. So just go in the doors from business, right? So through the atrium, and then just kind of up past the elevators, go to the right, and we're at the end of that hallway.
I asked people in Torrey, they're like, I'm sorry, I don't know where it is. So, can I go?
I mean, am I trying to think? I was going to do another review next Wednesday. If that doesn't work, we can book a